Well, as of today, the Liberals are now 4 seats shy of a majority government. And what happened in Ontario is a big factor in that. The Liberals lost 9 seats in Canada's largest province, and the Conservatives made significant inroads in the 905 and dominated southwestern Ontario. Data from Polara Insights underscores why that may be. Among decided voters in Ontario, the Liberals led by 11 points among white-collar workers, the suits, but the Conservatives led by 19 points among blue-collar workers, who Pierre Poilievre called the Boots. So for a look at Battleground Ontario, we've brought back our Ontario panel. Rob Benzie is the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Sabrina Nanji is the founder of the Queen's Park Observer. Good to see you both. Sabrina, what do you make of this data from Polara suggesting a lot less blue-collar workers voted Liberal? How does what the Conservatives got compare to what Doug Ford usually gets, the progressive Conservative Premier, for example?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why, Doug Ford has won 3 majorities in a row, and, his campaign team will tell you, is because they've made a lot of inroads with organized labor, and that's private sector unions in particular. So, I would be interested to see even deeper, those Polara numbers, how many of those Boots were private sector unions, what industries were they working in? I think it also tracks with what we saw geographically, right? You mentioned there were big pickups in the 905 in Windsor, where obviously affordability, housing, crime, a lot of stuff that Pierre Poilievre was talking about, during the campaign and in those final days really matter. And I would say even arguably more so than the Trump factor, right? We know that Trump maybe helped Mark Carney's side, not so much Pierre Poilievre, but I think that we can't really discount a lot of what he was talking about in those final days and, what those issues were in the areas where he was able to pick up.
I'm going to get up and play with the map if I can, because, Benzie, I want to illustrate what happened in southwestern Ontario in particular, and they're going to take this away any day now that the election is over. But, we'll zoom in on that southwestern Ontario region, right, because this is the most trade-exposed part of Ontario. Yeah. You see the Liberals, a couple of seats in London, in Kitchener, and if you extend it and go all the way over to Hamilton. But look at all this blue, and this is the change, right? Last time, Liberal and New Democrat in Windsor, none of that. A New Democrat in London, that's gone. And, the New Democrats knocked out of Hamilton and the Greens out of Kitchener. It's just blue, 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 blue. That's a lot of auto workers, right? That's a lot of people who support the auto. What do you make of that shift in southwestern Ontario?
Well, I mean, I do think that the boots not suits pitch that Mr. Poilievre used, which was very much modeled on what Premier Doug Ford first unveiled in 2022 in his first re-election. We called it the big blue collar machine, and it worked. It was thanks to former Labour Minister Monty McNaughton, who, by the way, was helping the federal Tories in this campaign, and they made that outreach to private sector unions like LiUNA and others, and it was helpful. It worked. Now, the only thing is, though, David, are the Tories maxed out? Because if you look in Toronto, for example, they only won 1 seat. Roman Baber in York West took out Yara Sachs. And that's it in Toronto, in the city of Toronto. Yes, they won 2 seats in Brampton, but nothing in Mississauga. And in Durham, Jamil Javani won his seat. But as he even mentioned in his interview with you just now, that he's really the only one from that part of the 905. So they have growth potential, but is Pierre Poilievre, a guy who lost an Ontario seat in Carleton by almost 4,000 votes, is he the guy to take them to the next level in places like the city of Toronto, in places like Mississauga and in Brampton, where those were narrow wins in Brampton?
Well, they got 1 in Brampton. That's the one they got there, and it's York Centre that they did get in Toronto. But Sabrina, to Benzie's point. Look, if you want to cut the public service and you support the convoy, the National Capital Region is going to be a tough play for you. But, when you're talking about affordability, where people have big mortgages in the area around Toronto, when you're talking about crime and the suburbs worry about that, I mean, we can show the change here. There is mostly red, but if you go back to 2020, the last time people voted, with the exception of Toronto St. Paul's, the by-election kind of almost like a fluke now because it flipped back. You saw all red there, and then boom, they dominate York region. They're into the Bramptons, and some of the Brampton wins, Sabrina, for the Liberals were thin, a lot thinner than I think they expected. What do you make of that, Sabrina?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, obviously, we know Ontario can make or break you federally, and the path to majority runs through the 905, and we saw the Liberals lose some ground there, and I think that the Conservatives were at least successful, when it comes to Ontario in holding Carney back from that majority territory. Mind you, it's still a very strong minority.
Yeah.
They also, the Liberals took up some of the NDP vote. You're looking at Toronto. I mean, the NDP is just completely wiped out now. But you're right. I think a lot of the issues that Pierre Poilievre was talking about, in the 905, especially being tough on crime, I think that really spoke to that region in particular. You mentioned affordability and at Toronto, at the suburbs outside Toronto, but also I think in Windsor, him talking about how he's in favor of EV subsidies and was going to keep those agreements in place. I think probably helped put him over the edge in auto industry territory down there in Windsor. But yeah, you're right. I think that this clearly shows that Ontario is like not just a battleground, but where the federal governments are made or not.
Yeah, and Rob, going back to Brampton and Peel region,
Yeah.
I know that this has always been held pretty strong for the Liberals the last 4 elections now, and I know they felt it was going to be good, but they were worried about what they saw in their internal data, a softening in South Asian support, mostly with second and third generation South Asians, though, right, who are younger, more worried about crime, more worried about affordability, and that's who Pierre Poilievre has been targeting. And, while the core of Toronto, no-go, because the Progressives kind of all rallied together, in the suburbs, there is room for something there, it seems, for them next time around.
Yeah, if this leader can grow and if this leader can evolve, we've seen an evolution from the Premier of Ontario from when he was first elected in 2018 to his re-election on February 27th. He's built a broader coalition. His cabinet is the most diverse in the history of Ontario, and he has all the seats in Brampton, all the seats in Mississauga, and even a lot of seats in Toronto. People forget that the Conservatives have a lot of seats in provincial seats here in the city. And I think, but I'm still not totally convinced that the Conservatives are learning the lessons from the campaign that they need to learn. David, can you imagine if they had not been at war with Premier Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives? There were some other ridings that they would have won. They would have maybe won the other Brampton seats. They would have taken a Mississauga seat or two. And I think it would have helped them. But for whatever reason, they thought that Ford wasn't pure enough. He didn't pass that purity test of the Conservatives. I thought it was interesting. That was a really good interview that you had, by the way, with Mr. Giovanni. I thought he was much more measured than he was with David Common on election night when he made headlines across the country. After in that pre-dawn rant against Mr. Ford. And I think they need to present the face that Mr. Giovanni presented earlier in the show, more than this kind of angry, casting aspersions at other Conservatives, Tim Houston or Doug Ford.
Well, that's that other David C. He just riles everybody right up. That comment, he's a hype man. But Sabrina, I wonder about that because that interview with Jamil Giovanni was a lot of anger directed at Doug Ford, and relations were not good. Between some provincial progressive Conservatives, I know they're not the same as federal Conservatives, but there's a lot of overlap in workers and donors and supporters. I mean, are you getting any sense at Queen's Park that this could change going forward, or as long as Doug is there and Pierre is here, it ain't going to happen?
I mean, yeah, I'm here for this Tory civil war. Obviously, people like us, it's, would just pass the popcorn. But yeah, it does seem like, the knives are out, and there's a lot of blame to be thrown around right now, right? Like hindsight is 2020. A lot of people are blaming Donald Trump. A lot of people are blaming Doug Ford. But I think, yeah, to Benzie's point here, the federal Conservatives, there was a missed opportunity here. They really could have, followed in Doug Ford's playbook playbook. Doug Ford is someone that emphasizes he's a progressive and progressive conservative. He is a big spender, and he has changed a lot. He's learned a lot of lessons, and I think that he's had his fair share of scandals, but is somehow he's like this Teflon premier. And I think that the conservatives, if they had maybe followed his playbook a little more closely, they could have maybe made some more inroads in Ontario and made it a lot harder for Carney and the Liberals. But in terms of whether or not they're going to be buddy anytime soon, I don't think that's happening.
So Rob, just give you the last quick word here, but it's hard for a federal Conservative Party to be sort of a replica of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, because you've got Alberta, you've got Saskatchewan, you've got just a different constituency that you've got to factor in. So it's tough. You can maybe be friendlier with Doug Ford, but it's tough to be just like Doug Ford, because there's just two different types of styles and conservatism there.
Yeah, that's for sure, David. It's a shakier coalition that the federal Conservatives have to deal with. But 30% of of Doug Ford's voters, people who voted for Doug Ford on February 27th, voted for Mark Carney. That's a lot of potential votes for the Conservatives, the federal Conservatives, and they, for whatever reason, didn't feel that they needed to reach out to Mr. Ford. The first time that Mr. Poilievre ever spoke to Mr. Ford at length was on March 17th, just before the election. And it was too late. On March 18th, Doug Ford had Chrystia Freeland at his home making coffee and posting selfies on Instagram. So this is the thing. Relationships are important in politics. And I'm still surprised that these guys felt they were so far ahead that they could afford to not be nice to Tim Houston or to Doug Ford. And guess what? It showed that they won one seat in Nova Scotia, and they only won 53 in Ontario. That's great, except the Liberals won 69.
Yeah, well, if the Liberals had just held on to what they had, they'd have a majority government too. So there's lots of conversations about Ontario in the leading parties. Thank you for having a conversation with me about Ontario. I had to sit down from the map. It's been a long week. Rob Benzie, Sabrina, Nanji, thanks so much for being here. We'll talk soon.